If you open a standard history textbook, the story of the Cold War usually begins in the rubble of Europe immediately following the Second World War. But global ideological standoffs rarely materialize overnight out of thin air. You need friction to build up first. We point to 1947 as the trigger year. The United States announces the Truman Doctrine to contain communism and rolls out the Marshall Plan to pump billions into foreign economies. Look closely at the diplomatic climate back then, and you'll find these were aggressive countermeasures to a problem that already existed. To find the actual origin point of this global competition, we have to wind the clock back 3 decades, right to the moment the Russian Empire collapses into pieces. 1947 did not ignite a new conflict. The post-war treaties and doctrines merely marked the boiling point of an ideological feud that had been simmering since World War I. In 1917, the newly empowered Bolsheviks took control of Russia and alienated almost everyone. They pulled out of the ongoing World War, refused to pay back massive foreign loans, and happily leaked British and French state secrets to the public. For the Allied powers, pulling out of the war meant removing a massive military asset right when Western nations were fighting for their own survival. Britain, France, and other Allied nations struck back. They sent weapons, funding, and eventually their own troops to help the anti-communist White Army try and crush the revolution before it could stabilize. The intervention failed. Vladimir Lenin's faction won the Civil War and officially established the Soviet Union in 1922. The Western powers now had a sprawling, radically opposed state on their hands, and they had to figure out how to deal with it. Right from the starting line, the relationship ran on unpaid debts and armed proxy intervention. Both sides baked intense paranoia into their diplomacy. In the 1920s, deeply indebted Western governments found themselves awkwardly dependent on the resource-rich Soviet economy to help their own markets bounce back. The Soviets were happy to trade, but they also used the opportunity to fund radical political dissidents across Europe and run extensive espionage rings to steal military documents from the very nations they were doing business with. Even with the obvious spying and mutual distrust, commerce usually wins out. By 1933, American businessmen realized there was money to be made from a growing Soviet economy, and Franklin Roosevelt finally recognized the government in Moscow. So, with all this diplomatic sabotage, why didn't the Cold War officially start here? Because the anti-communist world was deeply divided. For the Western democracies, the real immediate threat wasn't coming from Moscow, but from the aggressive expansion of fascist regimes in Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo. The global standoff was effectively put on hold. The West was too fractured by internal politics and too distracted by the existential threat of a Second World War to unify their foreign policy against the Soviet Union. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the ideological feud had to be shelved. The Allies and the USSR were forced into a marriage of convenience to stop a common enemy. Even during the fighting, the old paranoia dictated their strategy. The US and UK deliberately delayed opening a second front in Western Europe, perfectly content to let the Soviets absorb horrific casualties, fighting the bulk of the German army in the east. When the war ended, the Soviets made sure those casualties paid geopolitical dividends. They refused to leave the territories they had occupied in Eastern Europe and Iran, installing aligned governments to create a massive physical buffer zone around their borders. The United States and Britain immediately pushed back. They abruptly cut off vital Lend-Lease aid to cripple the Soviet rebuild, and the US made sure Moscow was highly aware of their newly developed atomic arsenal. By the time President Truman officially pledged to support any government threatened by armed communist uprisings, Moscow answered by centralizing foreign policy for communist parties across all of Europe. The defeat of Germany and Japan removed the only physical threat that kept the US and the USSR occupied. With the Axis powers destroyed, 30 years of suppressed paranoia finally crystallized into a direct two-sided standoff. This brings us back to 1947. Finding a definitive starting gun for this era is historically impossible, because both sides spent the entire timeline justifying their current actions as a defense against something the other side did yesterday. The beginning of the Cold War depends entirely on where you sit. For the Americans, it might be 1947. That from the British viewpoint, the mutual hostility goes straight back to the 1917 revolution, and in China, internal civil wars and shifting alliances make the timeline look entirely different. 1947 remains the textbook standard for one simple reason. It is the year both superpowers dropped all pretense of being allies. They openly drew the lines and forced the rest of the world to pick a side. No single starting gun fired to begin the Cold War. A continuous, escalating loop of retaliation had simply run out of shadows to hide in.